The aging man sat quietly in his dimly lit home, a small cabin at the edge of a desolate colony. His wrinkled hands rested on the edge of the table, gripping a weathered mug. He hadn't expected to live long. His body had started to wear down years ago. But there was one thing he hadn't given up on, the hope that his son, the one he hadn't seen in over a decade, would return. Every night, the old man would gaze up at the stars, waiting for a glimpse of the ship that would bring his boy home. He had been a soldier once, a warrior who fought for a cause. He had seen too much war, too many battles fought under the banner of the Galactic Empire. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, he was a ghost in the far reaches of space, forgotten by those who once knew him. His past had been buried, his records erased, his identity erased as if he never existed. The Empire had a habit of erasing people, especially those it no longer found useful. They were methodical in their purges, making sure to eliminate anyone who posed even the slightest threat to their control. They couldn't afford to let anyone speak out against their reign. Not even someone as insignificant as the old man. But that's what they thought. He wasn't just a relic of a past life. His son was out there, and the Empire had no idea just how dangerous he was. The old man was stirring a pot of stew when the sound of boots echoed outside. He didn't have to look up to know what was happening. The stormtroopers had arrived. He had heard the chatter, seen the shadows on the horizon, and knew this was inevitable. He wasn't afraid. He was at peace with his life, with his choices. His son had become everything he had hoped for, a symbol of strength, courage, and defiance against an oppressive force. The Empire's presence was unwelcomed here, but that didn't matter anymore. The old man knew the cost of silence, the cost of compliance. He had lived through it all, but now, it was time for the reckoning. A knock at the door, and the man stood to face it, his hands steady as ever. A trooper stepped inside, rifle raised, eyes scanning the cabin with suspicion. "We need to speak with you, old man," the trooper growled, his voice a blend of arrogance and disdain. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He knew this was coming, knew the Empire would want to stamp out any remnants of rebellion or dissent. He had no more words for them. They weren't here for conversation. They were here for one thing only, to ensure he would never speak again. "You're coming with us," the trooper said, motioning for his comrades to move closer. The old man raised his eyes to the trooper's face, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you've done." The trooper sneered, clearly dismissing the old man's words as the ravings of a dying man. They didn't care about his past, didn't care about the silent battles he had fought. They only cared about silencing anyone who could stand in their way. The old man was taken without resistance, marched through the streets as an example to others who might consider defying the Empire. The colony was small, its people meek, but they knew better than to speak up. They had seen what happened when you defied the Empire. Still, some of them dared to look out their windows, some dared to watch as the old man was led away. They knew nothing of the man's true significance, nothing about the fire that burned beneath his still, weathered exterior. The march ended at the central square, where a small crowd had gathered. The soldiers pushed the old man to his knees, presenting him as an example of what happened to anyone who dared resist the Galactic Empire's rule. The young men and women in the crowd avoided his gaze, afraid of what might happen if they acknowledged the injustice before them. The Empire's officers stood over him, ready to deliver their judgment. No trial. No defense. Just an execution. They had done this 1,000 times before, and the old man was just another statistic. He didn't matter to them. To them, he was a relic, a fossil of a time long gone, not even worth the space his body would occupy in the Empire's waste heap. But that was their mistake. They didn't understand the true cost of erasing someone's life. They didn't understand that the old man was not alone. He had never been alone. As the soldiers prepared to carry out the execution, the old man's last words cut through the air like a blade. "You don't know what you've just done." The crowd fell silent, but no one spoke. The soldiers didn't care. They didn't even flinch. They pulled the trigger, and the old man's life was snuffed out in an instant. They had no idea that those words, spoken in the last moments of his life, would echo through the stars, reaching the one person who could destroy everything they had built. His son. The leader of the deadliest Special Forces unit the Empire had ever faced. Deep in the heart of a war zone, the son sat, listening to the quiet hum of the ship's engines. His mission had been simple: eliminate a target. But when the message came through, everything changed. The feed started as a simple news broadcast, just another execution in the galaxy's endless cycle of war. But when the face of the old man appeared on screen, everything stopped. His heart sank. The old man. His father. Killed by the very people he had sworn to destroy. A silent rage began to grow in the pit of his stomach. The Empire had made a grave mistake. They had killed the wrong man. The son's eyes hardened as he stared at the screen. Without saying a word, he turned to his unit. They didn't need an explanation. They knew what had just happened. They knew the Empire had awakened something it couldn't possibly defeat. With a quiet command, the son made the decision that would alter the fate of the galaxy forever. "Prepare for war," he said, his voice cold, his resolve unshakable. The battle had only just begun. The ghosts had no formal name. They were a unit shrouded in rumors, myths, and whispers. To the Empire, they were just another rebel faction, nothing more than an annoyance. But the soldiers who faced them, the ones who survived to tell the tale, they knew the truth. They were far worse than an annoyance. They were a nightmare made flesh. The ghosts didn't fight like any other unit. They didn't follow orders the same way. They didn't fight with numbers. They fought with precision, with speed, and with fear. The ghosts were lethal. And their commander? He was a man who had been forged in the fires of war, a man whose name was known only in hushed tones by those who lived in constant dread. The son of the old man was not a man of many words. His reputation was built on the bodies of his enemies, on missions so flawless that no one knew they had ever happened until it was too late. He was the shadow in the night, the executioner whose presence was felt before it was seen. His unit was like him, silent, deadly, and terrifyingly efficient. They didn't engage in conventional warfare. They didn't fight battles for the sake of victory. They fought to make statements, to leave destruction in their wake, and to make sure that no one would forget that they had been there. When the son saw the footage of his father's execution, it wasn't rage that overtook him. It was something colder, something more terrifying. The old man had lived his life in the shadows, but now, the son was going to drag the Empire into the same darkness. The Empire had killed the wrong man. They thought they had simply eliminated an old veteran, but they had triggered something far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The son's unit had only one mission now: revenge. The plan was simple: no mercy. The Empire had made their choice, and now they would pay. The son's voice was calm as he addressed his team, his words carrying the weight of everything they had fought for. "This is personal. We're going to make them regret ever touching him." The ghosts moved in silence, their operations swift and brutal. The first strike came against a small Imperial outpost on the fringes of the Empire's territory. There was no time to wait for reinforcements, no time to prepare. The ghosts didn't need time. They moved in, eliminated every single soldier in a matter of minutes, and then disappeared before anyone even knew they had been there. There was no glory in this for them. No celebration. It was only the beginning. The Empire, meanwhile, continued its war, oblivious to the growing threat. The son's attacks were not just about death, they were about sending a message. A message that would echo through the halls of power, through the very core of the Empire. Each strike left behind more than bodies. It left behind a mark, a symbol of the Empire's folly. The people on the fringe worlds began to take notice. Those who had been too afraid to stand up before, those who had felt powerless under the Empire's boot, started to believe that resistance was possible. The son wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for something greater. He was fighting to tear down the Empire, piece by piece. As the weeks passed, the son's reputation grew. The attacks became more frequent, more daring. Each mission left fewer survivors and even fewer clues as to who was behind them. The Empire was beginning to realize that this was no ordinary insurgency. They were being hunted, not by an army, but by a specter. A man who knew their every move, who could strike at will, and who had no intention of stopping until they had paid for what they had done. The son's command was absolute. His unit operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their missions executed flawlessly, without a single misstep. Their training was unparalleled, their loyalty unbreakable. They were more than soldiers, they were ghosts, appearing and disappearing as they chose, leaving behind only destruction and fear. In the dead of night, the ghosts would infiltrate Imperial bases, hacking into communications and wiping out entire command centers in a matter of minutes. They struck at the heart of the Empire's military infrastructure, cutting off supply lines, sabotaging weapons depots, and crippling the Empire's war machine from within. Each operation was meticulously planned, each target carefully selected. The Sun knew that every attack needed to serve a larger purpose. He wasn't just killing to kill, he was setting the stage for something bigger. He was weakening the Empire, dismantling it from the inside out, making sure that every blow they dealt would bring them closer to the end. The Empire's commanders were baffled. How could a force so small, so seemingly insignificant, inflict such widespread damage? How could a handful of soldiers reduce the mighty Empire to chaos? They responded with greater force, deploying entire battalions to crush the insurgency. But the more they sent, the more their resources were spread thin. The more they looked for the ghosts, the more they failed to find them. One by one, the Empire's strongest leaders fell. High-ranking officers, once untouchable, were found dead in their own offices, their throats slit in their sleep, their deaths clean and efficient, with no trace left behind. The Empire scrambled to find an answer, but the more they searched, the further they were from the truth. They had no idea who they were truly dealing with, no idea that the leader of this shadow war was someone who knew their weaknesses better than anyone else. The Sun had once been a part of their ranks. He knew their tactics, their strategies, and their weaknesses. And now, he was using that knowledge against them. The attacks kept coming, each one more precise than the last. Entire divisions were wiped out overnight, and the Empire began to feel the weight of its mistakes. Every mission was a statement, a warning that they had awakened a force they could not control. The ghosts were no longer just a threat, they were the end of the Empire. The Empire had always prided itself on its control, its grip on every corner of the galaxy. They believed their power was absolute, that no one could challenge their dominance. But now, with every strike, every brutal assassination, the walls they had built began to tremble. The Empire had always been quick to dismiss its enemies, always quick to crush rebellions before they could gain any real traction. But these attacks, these were different. The Empire had underestimated the ghosts, and now, it was starting to show. At first, the higher-ups refused to acknowledge the scale of the threat. After all, how could a few rebels, no matter how well trained, pose any real danger to the Empire? They threw a few extra soldiers at the problem, sent out more patrols, and fortified their bases. But nothing worked. The attacks didn't stop. Instead, they intensified, growing more precise and more deadly with each passing day. The Sun wasn't just waging a war, he was slowly dismantling the Empire's very foundation. The soldiers of the Empire, those who were still alive, began to talk. Whispers spread from outpost to outpost. Stories of soldiers who vanished without a trace. Commanders who woke up to find their entire garrisons wiped out in the dead of night, their weapons useless, their communications jammed. The Empire couldn't understand it. They couldn't comprehend how these ghosts, a force of unknown size and strength, had infiltrated their ranks so completely. Their tactics were flawless. Every attack left the Empire reeling, confused, and paralyzed. In the capital, the Emperor himself grew worried. He'd never feared anything in his life, but these attacks, this quiet war being waged against him, was different. It wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a personal message. A warning. He had made an example out of the old man, thinking he could extinguish the last flicker of rebellion on the fringe worlds. Instead, he had lit a fuse that would consume everything. The Emperor's advisors met in secret, their faces etched with worry. They had never seen the Empire so vulnerable. It wasn't just about the death toll, it was the strategic damage, the humiliation. The ghosts weren't just picking off soldiers, they were striking at the Empire's pride. The Emperor ordered more resources to the front lines, but even his best generals knew that no amount of reinforcements could stop what was coming. The ghosts were everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. They knew how to exploit every weakness, every crack in the Empire's defenses. The more they tried to fight back, the more they were pushed into retreat. Despite the growing panic, the ghosts remained unseen. They struck with surgical precision, targeting key installations, high-ranking officials, and strategic communication centers. The Empire's response was always too late, and each mission left the same haunting message: The Empire had no idea who was coming for them. They had no idea who they had really angered. Back on the fringe worlds, the people who had once cowered under the Empire's thumb began to take notice. There was hope now, real hope, that maybe, just maybe, the Empire could be toppled. The Ghosts had become more than just a group of rebels. They were a symbol of resistance. The Sun's actions spoke louder than any words could. Every successful strike, every life lost in the name of revenge, chipped away at the Empire's invincibility. And the more the Empire retaliated, the more the rebels felt emboldened. But the Ghosts were not a rebellion born of hope alone. They had a purpose. They had a plan, and each attack was part of a greater strategy. The Sun knew that to defeat the Empire, they needed to strike at its core. They needed to break the Empire's ability to wage war. The Ghosts didn't fight for glory or for victory. They fought to destroy the Empire's power, to make it clear that no matter how strong they were, they could be undone by one simple truth: they were vulnerable. The Empire tried to regain control, sending larger forces to confront the Ghosts, but every attempt ended in disaster. The Sun's tactics were too effective, his operations too well executed. It wasn't just about military superiority anymore. It was about striking at the heart of the Empire's infrastructure, its leadership, and its resources. The Ghosts made sure that every Imperial soldier knew their name, knew their reputation, and knew that no matter how hard the Empire fought back, they would never win. Even as the Emperor tightened his grip, bringing in more troops and resources, it became clear that his efforts were futile. The Empire was losing more than just soldiers. It was losing control of its own destiny. The Sun had become a phantom, a figure who seemed to haunt every corner of the Empire, leaving destruction in his wake. The Emperor began to realize that it wasn't just a few well-placed attacks. It was an entire movement, a revolution that had already begun. And no matter how many soldiers he sent, no matter how many fortifications he built, the Empire could not stop what had already been set in motion. The Ghosts were unstoppable. They weren't a traditional army. They didn't rely on sheer numbers or brute force. They relied on something far more terrifying: knowledge, speed, and the willingness to destroy anything and anyone who stood in their way. The more the Empire tried to resist, the more it was clear there was no winning this war. The Sun had already won. And with each passing day, the Empire's grip on the galaxy weakened, as the rebellion, the vengeance, and the Ghosts of the past grew stronger. The Empire's downfall was no longer a distant possibility. It was inevitable. The Sun's relentless campaign had broken the Empire in ways it could not recover from. The once mighty forces of the Empire, its vast fleet, and well-trained soldiers had been undermined by the Ghosts' surgical strikes. It wasn't the losses in men that hurt them, it was the unraveling of their infrastructure. Communication systems were down, supply chains severed, key leadership targets eliminated with precision. The Empire was suffocating, its every attempt to reassert control met with a crushing counterstrike. Every decision the Emperor made only deepened the hole. He had no way of stopping the Ghosts, no way to predict where they would strike next. The Sun and his unit had made sure of that. They had placed their hands on the pulse of the Empire and squeezed until its heart started to fail. But it wasn't just the physical strikes that had hurt them. It was the psychological toll. Officers who once commanded with confidence now questioned everything. Soldiers, once loyal and proud, began to wonder if their Emperor's promises were worth dying for. The fear of the Ghosts had spread like a disease, and even the most seasoned Imperial troops found themselves doubting their leaders. It didn't help that the Sun's reputation had now taken on a mythical quality. No longer just a commander of a Special Forces unit, he had become a legend in the eyes of the galaxy, an unstoppable force whose wrath was something even the Empire could not fathom. Some Imperial officers began to view the war not as a battle for survival, but as a race against time. They knew that the Ghosts were coming for them, and they knew they couldn't hide forever. The Sun had no need for grand speeches or rallies. His actions spoke for him. The Ghosts didn't leave behind inspiring messages. They left destruction. Every attack they carried out was another nail in the Empire's coffin. It wasn't about taking ground or securing territory. It was about breaking the Empire's resolve, about forcing them to see that their power was an illusion. The Sun didn't fight for the galaxy's freedom. He fought for revenge, for his father, and for the countless lives the Empire had destroyed. But in doing so, he had awakened something far larger than personal retribution. He had sparked a fire that was impossible to extinguish. With each attack, with each high-profile assassination, more and more systems began to turn against the Empire. Worlds that had once been firmly under Imperial control started to resist. The message was clear: if the Empire could be brought to its knees by the ghosts, then it was only a matter of time before the galaxy itself rose up. The Empire's strength had always been its control over countless systems, but now those systems were looking to the ghosts, hoping for salvation. And the Sun's forces, though small in number, began to grow in influence. People rallied to their cause, motivated not by idealism, but by the knowledge that the Empire was no longer invincible. The Emperor, in his final act of desperation, ordered a full mobilization of the Imperial fleet. It was his last play, his attempt to stamp out the rebellion once and for all. But he had underestimated the Sun and his ghosts. The Sun's attacks had never been random. They were calculated, precise, designed to provoke a specific reaction. The Sun knew that the Empire's forces were spread too thin, that they would overextend themselves in their desperate attempt to crush him. When the fleet arrived, they found nothing waiting for them but a trap. The ghosts had already infiltrated their communications and systems. They had already sabotaged key ships in the fleet, disabling them before the battle had even begun. The Empire's forces were scattered, disorganized, and blind. It was as though the Sun had anticipated their every move, and in truth, he had. He knew how the Empire fought, how they thought, and he used that knowledge to turn their strengths into weaknesses. The battle that followed was swift, brutal, and ultimately pointless for the Empire. The Sun and his unit cut through their lines like a blade through paper. The fleet, once a symbol of the Empire's might, was shattered. But the victory wasn't just in the destruction of ships, it was in the complete dismantling of the Empire's strategy. The Sun had demonstrated that no matter how large the force, no matter how powerful the fleet, they were all vulnerable. He had proven that the Empire was nothing without its illusion of control. The Emperor watched as his empire crumbled before him. His attempts to regroup, to rally his remaining forces, were futile. There was no one left who believed in his ability to lead. The Sun had broken the Empire's back, and there was nothing left for the Emperor to do but try to flee. But even in his desperation, the Emperor knew it was too late. The ghosts had already won. The final blow came not from a fleet or an army, but from a single message. The Sun, his unit standing as the last vestige of defiance against the Empire, broadcasted a transmission to the entire galaxy. It was a simple message, but one that carried the weight of everything the Empire had done. The Galactic Empire has fallen. The galaxy is free. Those words echoed through the systems, and for the first time in decades, the people of the galaxy dared to believe that freedom was possible. The Sun had not just avenged his father's death, he had broken the chains that bound the galaxy to an empire that had ruled through fear and oppression. His revenge had been swift and brutal, but it had also been the catalyst for a revolution that would ripple through the stars, forever changing the fate of the galaxy. And as the last remnants of the Empire collapsed, the Sun stood among the ashes of their once great empire, knowing that the fight was over. The war was won, not just by force, but by the understanding that no matter how powerful an empire becomes, it can always be brought down by the actions of a few determined souls. The Sun's mission had been completed. The Empire was dead. And now, the galaxy was free.